Hey y'all, welcome to the channel. Today we're checking out the insane plan to build a bridge to Ireland. Wow, that does sound insane.
It's a bridge with potential to create a Celtic powerhouse, one that could span the Irish Sea and intertwine the economies of the British Isles to an extent that's never been seen before. To hear its proponents tell it, the Irish Sea Bridge, also known as the Celtic Crossing, would be a great leap forward for the economic relationship between Britain and Ireland. It would bring the countries far closer politically. It would offer travel and opportunity to the people of both nations, and although it would be a very impressive undertaking of engineering and design, it wouldn't actually be impossible.
It kind of seems like a good idea. In a way, I'm surprised it hasn't happened already. That would have to be an extremely long bridge. I know in Florida there's a bridge that's 7 miles long that connects the mainland of Florida to the Keys, but I feel like that's more than 7 miles, and it's not as if there's no other way to get from one place to the other. I'm sure there are plenty of boats. So it might be wasted money, wasted time and effort, wasted resources. I don't know. Seems like a fun idea, if nothing else.
No, if it could be done, it had a very real chance to etch the names of its creators and its benefactors into history forever.
That's true.
So with a pitch like that, it's hard to believe that the Irish Sea Bridge has at present been entirely dismissed, somewhere between an economic pipe dream of the British Isles and a vanity project for the man-eating mob of hair formerly known as Boris Johnson. But the reality of the project is very different than what its most starry-eyed supporters would describe. So on today's episode of Mega Projects, we're going to go into the long-heralded Celtic Crossing, why it could exist, what it might look like, and why it might just all be a load of malarkey.
If it was something that was extremely needed for the countries to transport resources, I could see it happening. But we have boats. Why a sea bridge? Great question.
The concept of a sea link between Great Britain and Ireland, certainly not a new one. The idea was first proposed in the late 19th century by industrialists and unionists who wanted a potentially crucial commercial and strategic route between the islands. At the time, both countries could have benefited greatly from the sea link, which was imagined as a tunnel at the time rather than a bridge. The concept resurfaced in 1915 during World War I, then again in the 1950s, then again in the 1980s, and then finally in the 2000s, always as a tunnel. But despite a whole range of feasibility studies, the Sea Link was eventually dismissed each time as a prohibitively expensive engineering project and one that was unlikely to provide enough economic benefit in the long run to justify its creation. In 1988, when the matter was brought up to the Irish Minister for Tourism and Transport, the minister noted that a sea tunnel between Ireland and Britain could cost double that of the Channel Tunnel between France and Britain, while getting about 20% of the usage. With so many attempts and so many failures to even have a sea link attempted, it would be fair to wonder why the concept would be revived yet again in the 21st century, but the answer is, in many ways, more geopolitical than it is economical.
So they're saying it would cost twice as much as the tunnel to France be used 1/5 of the time. They would lose money on it. But it would be so cool. What about just the fact that it would be cool? Isn't that good enough reason?
The conversation was reinvigorated in 2018 amidst a period of open questions around the status of Britain as a cohesive nation-state, the role of Scotland in deciding its own future, and the complex, historically fraught interrelations between Ireland, Britain, and Northern Ireland, which is a part of the UK despite its geographic location on the island of Ireland.
When you think about the geopolitical stuff, I could definitely see how there's probably a large percentage of the population who would not want a bridge or a tunnel connecting the islands.
In early 2018, the UK's then Foreign Secretary Boris Johnson proposed the idea of building a bridge across the English Channel to provide a second link between England and France. Unfortunately, Johnson's imagined 22-mile-long bridge was promptly dismissed as being a little bit ridiculous, not just because it would require sticking a bridge in the middle of one of the world's busiest oceanic shipping lanes, but also because it would have been an extremely expensive solution to a problem that has already been solved with a quite famous undersea tunnel.
Yeah, there's already a tunnel. Why would you need a bridge in addition to that? I bet Boris bought stock in steel or something, or some kind of resource they would need for the bridge. That mother...
Already well known for his affinity for large infrastructure projects and proposals, Johnson received quite a bit of blowback from industry experts in large-scale engineering. As one architect, Alan Dunlop, put it would be easier and more convenient to just move France closer. But Alan Dunlop, in particular, decided to take things one step further. As a direct alternative to the English-French Sea Bridge, which had by then come to be known as the Boris Bridge, Dunlop proposed a bridge across the Irish Sea, linking Scotland and Northern Ireland. Although the proposal might have been at least a bit tongue-in-cheek, Dunlop was careful to clarify exactly why he dismissed the Boris Bridge. As he told architecture magazine Deason, "I'm not against a bridge from England to France. It's not an either-or response. A bridge crossing the English Channel, which is one of the busiest shipping lanes, would be economically challenging. This is why I said it would cost less to move France closer, although I have no doubt it would be technically achievable." As Dunlop explains, a bridge between the UK and Ireland would provide a political and infrastructural counterweight to the UK government's heavy spending in London and the East Coast, while being up to 6 or 7 times cheaper, significantly more useful, and more mutually beneficial to both countries. Dunlop's proposal started to gain traction fairly quickly, especially from the Conservative Democratic Unionist Party of Northern Ireland, the DUP, which historically has advocated against Irish nationalism in favour of cultivating British and Protestant culture.
So what I'm gathering is that Boris Johnson said, "Let's build a bridge to France." And this guy said, "That's a dumb idea. It would be better to build a bridge to Ireland." And people said, "Hey, that's not a bad idea."
The DUP quickly hopped on board the concept, supporting a crossing between Northern Ireland and Scotland, and they used their ties with Britain's Conservative Party to raise awareness of the project.
So the DUP wants Northern Ireland to be more absorbed into the United Kingdom, so it makes sense that they would want this bridge. That probably gave him a huge boner.
It's not difficult to see why the DUP would have wanted such a crossing. After all, a direct road and rail route between Scotland and Northern Ireland would have the potential to intertwine the Northern Irish economy with Britain more thoroughly, while forcing Ireland to rely on its northern partner as an economic facilitator if it wanted to use the route. By June of 2018, Boris Johnson himself agreed to seriously consider a sea bridge, and with more and more politicians from both Scotland and Northern Ireland giving their own support to the initiative, it began to seem like a realistic way to raise Britain's global profile while providing real economic benefits. The overall cost of the project was estimated to be somewhere around 15 or 20 billion pounds, certainly not cheap, but low enough that the combination of indirect economic rewards and direct traffic tolls could pay it back before too long.
15 to 20 billion is relatively not that much, but if you know anything about construction, it's going to take at least 3 times longer, and it's going to be at least 3 times more expensive than they estimate.
And when Boris Johnson became Prime Minister just a little over a year later, the Irish Sea Bridge became a concept that even its biggest critics had to begin to take seriously.
Interesting. So this idea that seemed like a crazy joke is suddenly becoming feasible in people's minds. I think that just goes to show the effectiveness of politics, unfortunately. Some people are really talented at persuading others to go along.
So, with the Celtic crossing looking more and more politically feasible in the UK, the next big question was how and where to actually build the thing. Historically, there are 4 proposed routes to cross the Irish Sea, each with its own advantages and drawbacks to consider. 2 of them connect with the country of Ireland and were not considered by the Johnson government, but the Irish Mail route, a 81-kilometre path from Dublin to Anglesey, Wales, deserves at least a mention, since despite its length, the rather
81 kilometers is how many miles? 50 miles. It's a long bridge.
Despite its length, the rather shallow depth of the seafloor is less than 100 meters all the way through, making it potentially easier than either method we're about to discuss. In terms of a bridge from Scotland to Northern Ireland, Alan Dunlop's proposal suggested 2 routes, one that would allow bridge construction for the shortest overall distance, and one to provide a more practical but more costly solution. The short route, a 20-kilometre or 12-mile crossing that would run between the Mull of Kintyre in Scotland and Torhead, Northern Ireland, would minimise the amount of Irish sea bridge that actually needs to be built. But that route had some fairly significant problems. The Mull of Kintyre is a basically uninhabited headland on the very sparsely populated peninsula of Kintyre.
Yeah, look at how that whole peninsula is connected. They would have to... Gosh, if you were trying to go from England and use the bridge over to Northern Ireland, you would have to go really far out. That's a huge detour. Probably not a
a
great place.
basically uninhabited headland on the very sparsely populated peninsula of Kintyre, several hours' drive from the nearest economically relevant city in Scotland. Torhead in Northern Ireland is similarly remote, meaning that if a crossing were to be done here, it would, in practical terms, be connecting the middle of nowhere with the middle of nowhere. The British government wouldn't just be building a bridge, they would be building long, expensive roads and railways just to get to the bridge, with no local infrastructure to support travellers on their journey. A somewhat more realistic option is the Galloway route, a 45-kilometre or 28-mile route running from Portpatrick, Scotland to Larne, Northern Ireland. This route is a whole lot easier route. A somewhat more realistic option is the Galloway route, a 45-kilometre or 28-mile route running from Portpatrick, Scotland to Larne, Northern Ireland. This route is a whole lot easier to work with. Larne is a fairly large town located just a half-hour's drive from Belfast, and though Portpatrick is 2 hours' drive from Glasgow and 3 from Edinburgh, it's at least inhabited, which is more than we can say for the short route. In 2010, the cost of a similar crossing was estimated at being under £20.5 billion. It's been a favourite of Northern Irish political parties, and despite its length, sea crossings of this size have been accomplished using bridges in the past. The real problem at the Galloway route, also called the Portpatrick-Larne route, is Beauford's Dyke, a massive undersea trench that would be unavoidable when building on this location. The dike is deep enough to cause some real issues, with a maximum depth of 300 metres, roughly 1,000 feet. But it's not just the depth that's a problem. Far worse is the fact that after World War II, Beaufort Dyke was where the British Ministry of Defence chose to dump roughly 1 million tons of unexploded munitions, which aren't likely to stay unexploded for long if they were to get, say, a bridge support structure dropped on top of them. The presence of radioactive material.
So probably don't build a bridge over and radioactive material.
The presence of radioactive material as part of what the Ministry of Defence dumped into the trench doesn't really help matters very much either. Alan Dunlop and other bridge proponents have suggested that the deepest and most explosive-laden parts of the dike could be avoided. But even if they can't, there's a real possibility that the problem could be dealt with by using a pontoon bridge, also known as a floating bridge. In modern times, only about 20 permanent floating road bridges have been built, but the technology has been used on sea crossings in the past. On a bridge like this, support structures don't run all the way to the ground, but instead float at or beneath the surface of the water, relying instead on cables to secure the bridge to the seafloor. This technique has...
That seems unstable. I don't know about that. Let's not do that, y'all. Let's not have a floating bridge. Basically driving on a raft? No.
Has been used in oil rigs and could conceivably be used here. And there are other ways to go about the depth issue too. A tall cable-stayed or suspension bridge could support itself with relatively few towers, meaning that relatively few towers would have to be built from the seabed or supported on small artificial islands, which themselves would have to be created. Or, as engineer Ian Firth explained to National Geographic, the tunnel itself could be put underwater but not underground in a submerged tube that could either be tethered to floating pontoons on the surface or tethered to the seafloor.
No.
Or both. But each option comes with its own drawbacks, each enough to at least raise questions about whether such an approach is even feasible. A floating bridge design would have to compensate for the rough Irish Sea, where harsh weather conditions and ocean currents would either require the bridge to be designed with flexibility in mind or structurally reinforced enough to resist the battering ocean. A submerged tunnel would mitigate the problems with surface weather, and it would have no risk of obstructing surface vessels, but would still struggle to deal with the undersea currents and would pose a major risk of flooding or fatalities from other accidents.
Taking all that into consideration, it'd probably just be easier to dig a tunnel under the water, right? Like the France tunnel. Let's do that.
And any approach using towers that do touch the sea floor greatly increases the risk of hitting that ordnance that could well have drifted into unexpected positions since it was dumped nearly a century ago. Perhaps most difficult of all, the Celtic crossing would require the winning design concept to be built on a scale that hasn't been attempted before, especially in the case of an undersea tunnel. And the drawbacks and considerations of each design sends the costs of the whole thing through the roof, no matter which direction the Johnson government might have chosen. The Øresund Bridge between Sweden and Denmark has been touted by the Irish Sea Bridge supporters as proof concept. But not only is the bridge far shorter than even the shortest option in the Irish Sea, but it's built entirely on a route no deeper than 10 meters under the sea, making it less of an example of an easily replicated success and more of a reminder of the many conditions that would make the Irish Sea Bridge more costly, more dangerous, and infinitely more complicated.
That looks like it's just not even a couple miles long either. We're talking 28 miles, or 12 miles was the shortest one, right? Yeah, that's not a good example.
Bridge more costly, more dangerous, and infinitely more complicated than the Orison Bridge ever was.
Where's the bridge?
So, on February the 10th, 2020, Downing Street announced to the public that now Prime Minister Johnson's administration was carrying out feasibility studies related to the Celtic crossing. By now, the Johnson administration had settled on the longer but more well-populated southern route, and Johnson himself had touted the plan as part of his broader approach to Brexit, which had just taken place a few days prior to Downing Street's announcement. At the same time, the announcement was taken with a mix of the same public skepticism that the Celtic crossing had been generating for years now.
Okay, wow, yeah. So he announced the project right after Brexit happened. That's a politically charged moment, I think.
And a new sense of dread over the idea that Johnson, now playing with the entire British budget as PM, might actually give the construction project the old college try. But before long, the project began to garner more and more pointed critiques from local officials in the areas where the bridge was to be built. Not only did locals on either side of the Irish Sea point out just how horrific the crossing would be in rough weather, so bad that it might necessitate frequent closures of the bridge if it were built, but they also raised questions about how exactly the government had come to believe that the road infrastructure on either side was equipped to handle the demands of construction or the volume of expected motorists.
That's a good point I didn't even think of. During the construction of the bridge, you got to get resources to the site, and those remote locations probably don't even have appropriate roads to get there. So they would have to build all that too.
One Scottish activist, Catherine Branson, kindly pointed out that Portpatrick, one of the projected endpoints of the bridge, didn't even have a two-lane road leading to the local ferry terminal. Other locals on both sides of the strait explained to the public that those pesky old munitions, allegedly buried in Beauford's Dyke, had a nasty habit of washing ashore on the beaches with astonishing regularity. With all that in mind, it's probably best that the Johnson government's feasibility study, released in November 2021, found the Celtic crossing to be an order of magnitude more expensive than Johnson, Dunlop, and others had previously suggested.
It's starting to sound like Boris just had a bunch of money to play with, and he thinks big construction projects are fun and cool. Sort of like I did at the beginning of this video, but now I'm seeing that it's probably a bad idea.
If the crossing were to be done by tunnel, the study found, it would run up a price tag of £205 billion. And the required depth of the tunnel, which could only be reached on limited gradients in order to prevent trains from derailing, would make it the longest undersea tunnel ever built. It would also have to do without a road component, which could not be considered feasible for safety reasons. A bridge would be even more expensive, £335 billion, and it too would have been the longest bridge in history. Both projects would have to come complete with massive infrastructure updates in the Scottish and North Irish areas where they came back to land. And even if the crossing was seamlessly approved through the British legislature and funded without issues or cost overruns, a best-case scenario would see the Celtic crossing opening 30 years from now. These estimates were nothing short of catastrophic for the proponents of the Irish Sea Bridge. Even despite the project's potential to transform the British Isles, there was absolutely no way that it could pay for itself within its creators' lifetimes, and some of those same creators might not even live to see it finished. The bridge would have undoubtedly opening from funded to land. And even if the crossing was seamlessly approved through the British legislature and funded without issues or cost overruns, a best-case scenario would see the Celtic crossing opening 30 years from now. These estimates was seamless in the would be even more expensive. Road component, which could not be considered feasible for safety reasons. A bridge would be even more expensive, £335 billion, and it too would have been the longest bridge in history. Both projects would have to come complete with massive infrastructure updates in the Scottish and North Irish areas where they came back to land. And even if the crossing was seamlessly approved through the British legislature and funded without issues or cost overruns, a best-case scenario would see the Celtic crossing opening 30 years from now. These estimates were nothing short of catastrophic.
So that would probably really end up costing $1 trillion, and it would take probably 100 years to build.
Catastrophic for the proponents of the Irish Sea Bridge. Even despite the project's potential to transform the British Isles, there was absolutely no way that it could pay for itself within its creators' lifetimes, and some of those same creators might not even live to see it finished. The bridge would have undoubtedly caused uproar in Parliament, and given the awful conditions present in the Irish Sea during some parts of the year, it seems utterly unreasonable to assume that the project would proceed on a best-case timeline. Some of the bridge's advocates, most prominently Alan Dunlop, expressed confusion on how the crossing's costs could have been assessed at £200 billion rather than £20 billion, but the damage was already done. The project was technically possible, but in a much more realistic sense, there was no way in hell that it could ever get done.
Okay, so Alan Dunlop is the guy who originally proposed it. I thought he meant it as a joke, but I guess not. But he's saying it would only cost $20 billion. He probably also thought it would take a weekend to build.
With such a crystal clear conclusion, Boris Johnson and his ministers had no choice but to accept the result and let go of the dream of an Irish sea bridge for good.
Well, that's a shame. It would be really cool, but I guess just not possible. They're going to have to keep riding in boats. That's not bad, right? Take a boat.
He took an additional shellacking when the Department of Transport announced that the study alone had cost the British taxpayer nearly £1 million. So there lies the Irish Sea Bridge, condemned once and for all as a pipe dream with little chance of being resuscitated in the future. With the stunning demands of the project now put on full display, it's unlikely that future administrations will have any interest in wedding themselves to a known political laughingstock. Without that sort of government interest, and without any other source willing to pour 3 times Bill Gates' net worth into a functionally doomed project, the Celtic crossing appears to have passed into the graveyard of mega projects that will never be.
Oh, well. Well, that's a shame. But it makes sense. Maybe one day technology will advance to the point where it is economically feasible. I know Elon Musk has a company called The Boring Company. I don't know how that's going, but for a while they were trying to build a tunnel from San Francisco to Los Angeles to build a high-speed rail. I've not heard anything about it in a while. But maybe if they make some advances with tunnel digging, maybe it would be actually possible. Wow, really interesting video. I had no idea that this was a thing. And it makes the tunnel from England to France seem even more impressive. Well, thank you guys for recommending. Thank y'all for watching, and I'll see you next time. Later.